Sweden is often considered one of the most secularized countries in the world. Research has shown that about 80% of the population do not consider themselves to be affiliated with any particular religion. While most Swedes might still technically be part of the Swedish church or give their children biblical names and celebrate Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter, most would argue that this is not necessarily a result of a direct affiliation with a religion, but rather with having grown up in a culture infused with Christianity. Indeed, when asked whether or not they believe in God, only about 23% of the population answered in the affirmative, and compared with the rest of the world, those are significant numbers. But this might give the idea of a population that is overwhelmingly atheist or that don't believe in anything at all, which does not reflect reality. Indeed, while most Swedes might not technically believe in God or affiliate themselves with a particular organized religion, research still shows that Swedes still very much have strong beliefs. Maybe belief in an afterlife, or the more abstract idea of a higher power or spiritual force that is in control of everything, and even things like angels. Now, the anthropologist Grace Davie once coined the term believing without belonging to describe a particularly sort of modern, secularized society and how many people still believe in things, maybe even things that we consider religious or spiritual, but they don't consider themselves to belong to any particular religion. And this seems to fit rather well into this sort of Swedish model that we're describing here. And in Sweden in particular, at the center of all of these profound questions is this, that thing that we generally and sometimes abstractly refer to as nature. Things like forests and lakes and fields and creeks, all the things that we consider to be outside of human influence. Indeed, nature and the experience of being in nature has become one of the key features of people's self-understanding, their place in the world, existential questions in general, and their spiritual self-image. So what's going on here? What is it about nature that is so spiritual or religious even to many people? How did this happen? And why is this idea so prominent in places like Sweden in particular?
Det glittrar så gnistrande vackert i ån. Det kvittrar så lustigt i furen. Här ligger jag lat som en bortskämd son, i knät på min moder naturen. Det sjunger och doftar och lyser och ler, från jorden och himlen och allt jag ser.
In fact, this phenomenon is not something that is unique to Sweden or to Swedes, even if they are somewhat overrepresented. In many places in Europe and America, there is an increased sense of nature as something that has healing effects. And research shows that there is something to this. Spending time in nature seems to increase people's mental and sometimes even physical health. In the last few years, we have seen the increased popularity of practices like forest bathing, which originally comes from Japan, and with the idea of walking in the forest, immersing yourself in nature in different ways to induce a relaxed state and often a sense of interconnectedness. A kind of meditation practice, if you will. It seems likely that this all belongs to the same phenomenon, and much new research is being done in the field of religious studies trying to unpack this quote-unquote religion of nature. We spoke to the scholar and historian of religion, Professor David Thurfjell, who has studied this topic for a number of years and recently actually published a book in Swedish called Granskogsfolk, which explores this very subject.
So basically, if you interview people in Stockholm, for instance, about their view of religion, many will respond that one of the things, I mean, they will say that they're not religious, they don't like religion, they're critical to religion, it's too much power and it's unscientific and all kinds of ideas. But then they will say, many of them, that, but on the other hand, sometimes when I take a walk in the park or when I go to the archipelago or when I hike in the mountains, I can feel something. Right. They say something like this. So people spontaneously make a connection in this part of the world, make a connection between their own experience in nature and what they believe religious people experience in the church or in the mosque or in the synagogue. So in one way to express that is to say that many people in this country would sort of subscribe to the notion that the forest is my church. And this idea that the forest is my church, nature is my cathedral, and I mean, phrases like this are also extremely common if you look in poetry and in pop songs and in fiction and in people's autobiographies and so on. So this is it's a trope. It's like a motif in Scandinavian culture.
The people David have spoken to over the course of his research talk about the powerful experiences that are had while in nature. There is something about the open fields, the wild forests and trees, the lakes and the quiet and often stillness that surrounds it that awakens the deepest existential questions and emotions. There's a certain poetic quality to this environment which reminds us of the transitory nature of life. To maybe speak in Taoist terms, there is a certain flow or way of the world that becomes especially apparent when we're out in nature, which we can then also, in which we can see ourselves and our lives reflected. We come into direct contact with both death and eternity and experience something like a boundary between the mundane and something much greater.
So I realized quite quickly when I started doing these interviews that there are two landscapes at play in these nature interactions. And one is the outer landscape with the trees and the mountains and the little rivers and the forests and everything. But then there's what you can then call an inner landscape, which is like the inner landscape of the interlocutors, the people I've interviewed, their own lives. I mean, their own life stories, their relations, their journey through life, if you want. And it's as if they constantly mirror their inner life in the outer landscape. So for instance, if I ask in the interviews, tell me about this forest, many will respond like, yeah, I had a stressful couple of years, you know. So they will answer about themselves when you ask about the forest. And so there are many instances then when what happens in your inner life is sort of, you get hold of it, or you can see it, or it's illustrated by what happens in the outer landscape. Yeah. So take the classical instance of following a path. I mean, it's very easy for us as a species, I think of our own life as a journey through a landscape. I think it comes very naturally to us. We can think of our life as a journey. We are walking, and our life is a path, and we're walking this path, and we come across different type of landscapes and different types of situations, just like a road that goes through a landscape. So this is something common, I think, for humans all over the world. And among these secular Scandinavians, then it would be something like, okay, so for instance, if you walk through a dark forest and suddenly you come up to a hill and the landscape opens up, so you get this view over the landscape and you can see far away and you don't really see where the path is leading. So this sense of the open-endedness of the landscape then reminds you of, well, this is like my life. My life is also open-ended. I don't know where I will go. I don't know if I will stay in this relation, in this job, in this city, or if I will move, or, you know. So there's this connection being made. I have another beautiful example from one of the interviews. One of the guys I interviewed had diabetes. So he was suffering from this disease. And he told me the story where he had been walking in the forest, and he stumbled across this blossoming apple tree. So it's an apple tree and it's blossoming in the spring, so it's full of white flowers. And it's very beautiful, and he's sort of stunned by the beauty of this tree. And then he walks up to it and he, sort of looks very closely on the individual flowers. And he discovers that he can't find even one flower that is perfect and flawless. I mean, every flower is a little bit tilted. It's some of the leaves have fallen off. None of them are perfect. And then he realizes from this sort of experience in the outer landscape that being a bit flawed this is the natural state of things. Yeah. Nature is not filled of perfect samples. All of them are a bit flawed. So having a chronic disease like this this is not a deviation from the normal state. It's not an anomaly. This is the normal state of things. And this is also what we experience as beautiful. So suddenly, by seeing this apple tree, he gets a different perspective on his own personal situation. This connection between the inner world and the processes that happen in my inner life, in my inner sort of landscape, when you feel that is reflected in the outer landscape, you get the sense of connection. So, which in its turn then creates the sense of not being so lonely, because I am this. I mean, people will tell me that in the city, when they live their hectic city lives with their social media and they're going on the subway and the city, the urban modern life, they feel a bit like a satellite, like sort of they are alone, they are an entity of their own, moving through this hectic city. But when they go out into the forest, they feel that their inner processes are going on outside of them as well. So they are part of a bigger process, dying and decaying and living, and sadness and happiness and coming and going, and all these things are happening outside of them and inside of them. So they feel less lonely.
In fact, this is one of the most recurring themes in all of these nature-related experiences, the feeling of being part of something greater. I think we've all looked up at the night sky and just been taken aback by the vastness of the universe, or stood at the edge of a mountain and just been in awe of the landscape in front of us. This is a feeling that's often both scary but also comforting at the same time. And there's a term that's been coined to explain this, which became especially popular in the Romantic era, which is known as the sublime. A experience of the sublime is an experience of something that both scares us and feels overwhelming, but also somehow comforting and beautiful at the same time. And this is, again, one of those themes that are recurring in all of these experiences that the informants or the people that David have spoken to in his research. In his 1917 book, The Idea of the Holy, the German philosopher Rudolf Otto talks about the experience of what he terms the Numinous as his central aspect of religion and spirituality. The Numinous is an experience of something wholly other, wholly different from the mundane experiences of everyday life, something beyond oneself and one's understanding. It's a, quote, non-rational, non-sensory experience or feeling whose primary and immediate object is outside the self. What Otto is describing here seems to correspond to a lot of experiences had by people in nature. It's a meeting with something greater, something existentially profound, standing in the borderlands between the mundane and the sacred, a little bit closer to the deeper meanings of reality. But while the experience of the numinous is defined as something wholly other, these feelings evoked can simultaneously also be deeply personal and close at the same time. One of the most common words that people use to express these experiences is connection, a feeling of being intimately connected to everything else around you, of being part of something greater. No longer are you a lonely human being in a strange world, instead you are at home wherever you go. In nature you can breathe, be yourself without the stress and expectations of others. You feel at peace with the way the world is, a sense of connection to the other creatures, to the trees, the plants, to the soil. Perhaps even a oneness with it all.
So one of those secularists, they might say they're running in the forest and they have this sense of interconnectedness or connection with the landscape, and what happens within me happens without, and I am an entity, but I'm also connected to a greater world and to nature and to the other species and to the ecological systems and to the universe, and we are all a part of this. And when especially if you walk for a couple of hours in the landscape, or if you run, or if you're really exhausted because you've been doing physical exercise there, this sense of sort of yourself sort of dissolving will be more prominent, because you're so tired that you can't really think or use your brain. So you become a body. You have this sensation of becoming a physical body in a physical world. And this sense of being alive among other things which are also alive, and we are just alive here together. Which is in one way similar to a sense of ego dissolvement that we find in traditional religion.
This is indeed another recurring theme in Professor Thurfjell's research. This deep interconnectedness with nature for many people goes as far as inducing an experience where there is a dissolution of the self, a disappearance of one's feeling of individuality and a kind of merging with the environment around you. This feeling of ego dissolution, in Latin often called Unio Mystica, the mystical union, is a common theme across many religious traditions of the world. Many have talked about becoming one with God or one with the rest of the world, and that seems to be what is felt for people in nature. In other words, being in nature seems to be able to induce states of consciousness perhaps as strong as some of the most profound religious experiences described across history.
Ja, vara ett med natten, ett med mig själv, med ljusets låga. Som ser mig i ögonen stilla, outgrundligt och stilla. Ett med aspen som darrar och viskar, ett med blommornas flockar som lutar sig ut ur dunklet och lyssnar. Till något jag hade på tungan att säga, men aldrig fick utsagt. Något jag inte ville förråda, ens om jag kunde.
So if that is a Christian person who has access to a Christian language, or a Muslim or a Jew or a Buddhist, then they will use that language to express that exact thing. So they'll say, well, I had a sense of, when they see beauty, they will say, this is like the grace. I feel an experience of the grace of God or the beauty of creation. But I'm not sure that the experience is so different. It's just the language is different. And of course, language forms experience, so it's complicated. But there is also, of course, a difference. I mean, it's not just the same, and the difference lies in the sort of the worldview or the interpretation of these experiences in terms of the metaphysical consequences they get. Yeah. Because they really don't have, the seculars that I've interviewed, they really don't have a belief in a transcendent reality in the sense of a continuation after this life of this individual self or something like that. And I actually made, in the end of the book, I make this comparison with a section from St. Augustine, when he has this famous question. So this is 4th century Christian thinker, and he has this question where he asked, what is it that I love when I say that I love my God? I say that I love God, says St. Augustine. So what do I mean by this? What is it I love when I say that I love God? It's quite a good philosophical question. What is it? What is the object of the religious feeling? And then he comes to some kind of conclusion about that, where he lists a couple of things which he is not loving when he loves God, and that is like all the temporal things, food that will disappear, and drink that will disappear. I love something that is eternal. And if you take that phrase from him, or that sort of his response to his own question, and you remove all the negative words, so instead of saying, I'm not desiring water that disappears, or food that decays, or love that will be ended by death, and you just remove all the not, then you will get something that is quite close to what my respondents think. Like the opposite. Yeah, it's almost opposite, because and this connects also to this sort of ecological movement and the engagement for climate change and for a dying planet and species being extinct and so on. So it's actually the fact that this tree or this forest, it can disappear. And if it disappears, it will never come back. And I love this. The respondents, they feel this strong connection to a world that actually can disappear. So they are not some kind of Neoplatonists who believe that this world is a mirror image of something that is eternal. This is actually what's there. It's the physical, natural world. It's there, and it's fantastic, and I'm a part of it, and I can dissolve into it, and myself is sort of interconnected to it. And they love it with a religious passion, and it can disappear. So death is there. So we need to, which also then creates a moral imperative to actually take care of it, because it can actually disappear.
There are many parallels here with other aspects of religious behavior and concepts. For example, many people will say that nature is their church, that this is the place where they can most easily come into contact with the divine in some way. And we can indeed observe how many people do start acting a little differently when in nature, ways that we would associate with sacred spaces like churches. They will, for example, fall silent when walking into nature, right? Become more quiet and treat it with a certain level of reverence and respect. Nature has become a sacred space, and this requires certain behaviors that we associate with other such sacred spaces. Now, one of the reasons that many people seem to have this kind of love and reverence for nature is that it somehow represents something that is authentic. We're often given this idea that our regular lives, which will often involve living in the city, having jobs, and participating in consumerism, that these things are somehow inauthentic, that this is an unnatural way to live. Now, we can discuss later on whether or not this is actually a kind of cultural construct, but this seems to be a very common idea. And nature, by contrast, is often defined as the very opposite of all these things. Nature is outside the city limits. Nature is beyond the influence of humans and all these societal structures. Nature is more real somehow, more authentic. It represents something primordial before the influence of all these inauthentic aspects of our regular lives. And because nature is real and authentic, this means that humans can use it as a kind of mirror. In the authenticity of nature, humans can experience something that is more real and more authentic within themselves. In the nakedness of the forest, we too become naked. We're stripped of all the masks that we wear, all the roles that we play to fit into society. We stand precisely as we are, completely authentic and free. Now, it's important to remember that while this is a very common attitude, a person like a farmer, for instance, that lives in nature will perhaps not make these clear distinctions between what is and what isn't nature, or in general will have a very different relationship and attitude to nature. But this kind of attitude that I've just described is very common today, especially in city environments or urban environments, and especially in the Nordic countries. And this is very important for the lives and spirituality for a lot of people today. But what's actually going on here? We do know that things like forest bathing, which comes from Japan originally, seems to work for people. But is there actually any science behind this stuff? And this is actually exactly what Professor Thurfjell is studying, and he argues that it is several different factors that are at play here. There are probably certain biological and psychological factors here that are important, but also deeply rooted cultural aspects.
There is actually quite a lot of research on from a biochemical, pharmaceutical, sort of natural science perspective on the health benefits of walking in forests. Mm-hmm. And they have all kinds of theories, and I cannot assess them because I'm not a natural scientist, but they have, there are these certain biochemical substances that you can find in certain plants that are beneficial for our immune system, and there are earth bacteria that are good for us, and obviously just walking and being outdoors and breathing fresh air and moving your body is, health inducing in all kinds of ways.
Scientific studies do indeed seem to indicate that being in nature has very positive effects on humans, both mentally and physically. One theory suggests that there are certain compounds given out by plants that have a calming and therapeutic effect on humans. The compound Phytoncide is given off by many plants in order to keep insects away, but may in fact instead have very positive and stress-reducing effects on us humans. Other theories try to connect it to psychology, that nature induces a certain state of attention in humans that is less demanding on the brain and its activity. Others still also connected to biology and evolution. The American biologist Edward O. Wilson coined the term biophilia to describe a hypothesis that humans have an innate drive to be attracted to and seek connection with other creatures and natural environments. We have evolved to be in need of certain things. Being close to water is beneficial on an evolutionary level because that means there are many other species close by, and its openness gives us a better overview of the environment, for example. This makes us feel safe and relaxed. But in places like Sweden in particular, there are also clear cultural and historical factors that have led to these strong positive feelings that Swedes have toward nature. To begin with, the nature of Sweden and the Nordic countries is very benign. There are very few creatures that can or will hurt you here, which of course results in a more relaxed relationship to nature. Compare this to other parts of the world where there could be dangers hiding behind every corner. In these places, people do not have the same reverence for nature, and perhaps for good reason. It's a wonder the Australians even leave their houses at all.
But there's also this cultural expectancy on nature to be health inducing. And if there's a cultural expectancy, and I have also a chapter on a psychological theory that can explain this, which we find in psychology of religion, but also actually in mainstream psychology as sort of I think it's quite a dominant theory nowadays, which is a theory called predictive coding. So the idea is basically that, and it relates to emotional responses to environment. So the idea is basically that our brain, through evolution, has evolved to be able to anticipate what's going to happen next. So we are walking in the forest and a bear comes out. And what happens? Well, our brain then, this is the lingo of this neuroscientific research. So the brain will respond by preparing the body for what it expects will now come. So when we see a bear, we will expect to have to fight or flee. So it will start those processes in our body which we need for fighting and fleeing, which is pumping adrenaline, raising the pulse or whatever, doing all kinds of stuff. And when our conscious mind experiences this change of our body, this bodily change, we will construe it as fear. So what is fear? Well, fear is the conscious experience of a physical change. Now let's say we get to know this bear, and it's a nice bear, and it's a friendly, domesticated bear, and we become best friends with the bear, and we hug it every day, and we love this bear. And then a year later, we will walk in the same forest, and this bear comes out. Now we know that this is not fleeing or fighting. It means cuddling and taking a nap. So then our body will respond, preparing our body for cuddling and napping, creating senses of calmness and slowing down and all those feelings. Yeah. So this is what emotion is, sort of the motor program of a body, the body responding for what the brain thinks will come next. So this means that the emotional reaction to something, a landscape for instance, or a person or a situation, is dependent on the expectation of what it will lead to. So if you have this sort of theory in mind, you can ask, why do people from this part of the world get a sense of comfort and familiarity and getting in touch with their emotions when they go to the forest? Well, it's because their system expects this forest to trigger those emotions. And then you can ask, why does the forest trigger those emotions? Well, it's because they have grown up in a culture, and this is very true if you've grown up in Sweden, where the school, all the children books, every poet, musical text, the general culture, the law, the curriculum for education, all of it tells this story again and again and again. The forest is a benevolent, beautiful place where you're supposed to feel safe and spiritual and calm, and which calls then in its turn for a historical explanation. So this is just a long detour to motivate why we need history of religions to understand something like this. And because this cultural sort of situation then has been created by a history. Yeah. There's an old cultural heritage in this part of the world of nature, of turning to nature, which goes deep and which can be found in pre-Christian times, and it's been there a long time in this part of the world. I mean, we can also find that type of attitudes in many parts of the world, but there's something specific, I think, in a European context, at least between the Germanic and the Latin parts of Europe where the northern Germanic cultures have been more nature-oriented in some sense for millennia. So there is this deep historical roots, and I don't want to deny those. But there's also, and then there's something culture-specific or regionally specific related to sort of the national romantic stories, the type of narratives about Swedes and Danes and Norwegians that were sort of cultivated by natural romanticism at the turn of the last century. So there's a story about nature love being a part of Swedishness, which has also formed then a part of a national self-identity, and which built, of course, on things that were there before, but sort of exaggerated them. And the same we find in Norway and Finland and Estonia and all these countries.
So as you can see, there are probably many different reasons why Swedes have such a strong emotional connection to nature. But regardless of the reasons behind it, it's clear that the experiences that people have in nature are some of the most profound in their lives. People will go on pilgrimages to natural sites, and they will experience a kind of borderland between the mundane and the so-called numinous, the other, and dare I say it, the spiritual or sacred. In nature, people are confronted with their own mortality, with the deepest existential questions and feelings, and a sense of belonging and a connection to all things around us. Some people even claim to experience a kind of ego dissolution or ego death in nature, as we saw. Or it's as simple as the fact that nature just makes us feel good. It relaxes us, it puts things into perspective, it makes all those heavy aspects of our lives feel not as heavy anymore in relation to the utter grandeur and beauty of the natural world around us. It feels, both internally and externally, more real. And if that isn't religious, I don't know what is.